Well, I'm delighted to be here with Lindsay Brown, our guest speaker for this evening. Love to just hear from Lindsay and ask him a few questions now. Lindsay, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great delight to be with you, Peter, and have connection with Ireland once again.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you back. And for those who don't know you, do tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, you can probably tell as soon as I open my mouth that I come from just across the water in South Wales. Actually, my wife comes from Pembroke, from where the ferry goes to Rosslare. And many years ago, I remember taking a team of students from there to Cork University for an evangelistic week. I come from a coal mining town called Merthyr Tydfil, where I grew up. And subsequent to going to university, I got involved in student ministry, first in my own country for 4 years as a staff worker. And then for the last 40 years, I've been working with IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. And in that time, I have had 3 roles. First, I was overseeing the development of the work in Europe for 10 years. Then I was International Director or General Secretary for 16. And the last 12 years, I've been helping to develop a network of university evangelists who come and speak at universities in events weeks and in individual public evangelistic meetings all across Europe. That network is called FOIA, the Fellowship of Evangelists in the Universities of Europe. I'm married to Anne, who is a great-grandmother, came from Ireland. And we have one son, Owen, who also worked as a staff worker. He was the team leader in Wales for, I think, 8 years. And he left about a year ago to begin work with Christians in sport, who work amongst elite sportsmen and women in universities across Europe.
Oh, marvellous. Great to have you with us. You mentioned that you'd made a trip across to Cork. Tell us more about that. And was that your only Irish visit during those years?
It was during those years. I've made a number subsequently. But that was actually my second visit to Ireland. I'd been there previously when I was on the Logos ship, Operation Mobilization ship, which came to Dublin. But after I left OM, I spent a year with them traveling around Africa. I joined the student ministry in Wales. And at the first student staff conference I went to, this was in December 1977, my first year as a student worker. There was a small group of folks from Ireland. Ted Cox was the leader, and they had just taken up residence as a kind of graduate team in Cork to try to help to develop the student work there. I think there were 3 people. There was also a graduate couple, John and Seska Tyrrell. And actually, John Tyrrell had been doing his doctorate studies in the University of Aberystwyth in Wales when my wife was a very young fresher. So she had seen them in Aberystwyth University, an interesting connection. When I heard from Ted in the staff conference about the needs in Ireland, I asked him, I thought maybe we could help with a team. So I said, would you like it if we could bring a team from Wales, the Welsh universities over and do a kind of events week or a mission week with you in Cork over Easter? So just 4 months after hearing from Ted, we were over there in April 78. I picked the best 15 student leaders I could find from across Wales, and we traveled there in a minibus. We tried all kinds of ways of connecting with people. I had sportsmen, artists. We had a mixture of men and women, some international students as well, who were very dynamic in terms of their testimony, guys from Nigeria. So we tried many different ways of connecting with Cork students that week. And at the end of it, to be honest, I was a bit disappointed because we hadn't seen, as far as I knew, anybody who had professed faith. And we threw everything at the students. But it was tough going, as was the scene in the Republic at the time. But then in God's goodness and providence, many years later, I think it must have been 25 or more years later, I was invited to speak at the All-Ireland Student Conference. And I remember I was doing a series of talks on Colossians. And on the first day, a young female student came up to me and she said, "My mother asked to be remembered to you." And I said, "What's your mother's name?" She told me. I said, "I'm sorry, I must be the wrong person. I don't think we've ever met before." And she said, "Oh, yes, you have." She said, "Didn't you come to Cork University in '78? I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "Well," I said, "Oh, it was a terrible week. Nobody became a Christian. It was really hard going. We felt as if we were hitting our heads against a brick wall. There was no response at all." She said, "Oh, yes, there was. Didn't you know? My mother became a Christian about 2 months after you left." And then she met my father and they got married. And my parents had 2 children, myself and my brother. Both of us became believers. Then she led her brother to the Lord, who became the principal of one of the Bible colleges or seminaries in Ireland. And then about 3 years ago, my grandmother became a believer through my parents' testimony. So my mother said to me, "If you see Lindsay, go and tell him what's happened in our family, what God has done, because it might encourage him." And that was a great encouragement to me, because it showed how important it is to view student ministry as a time of sowing as well as reaping, and that we have to trust God to bring forth the fruit in due course. Some people are converted many years later, and in some cases we don't actually see what happens. Interestingly, I had another example of that a few years back. I was in Paddington Station in London. This wasn't an Irish story, but the forecourt was packed pre-COVID, and I felt somebody touching me on the shoulder. I turned around, I saw this guy. He said, "Hi, Lindsay, do you remember me?" I said, "Yeah, you're Kevin. You're a geologist, aren't you?" He said, "Remember, you studied the Bible with me every Sunday afternoon 35 years ago in Oxford." And I said, "Yep, and you didn't move 1 inch, did you?" He said, "No, I didn't. I was hard as a rock." But he said, "I became a Christian last summer. And then I saw you for the first time in 35 years on the forecourt. I thought, I'll go and tell Lindsay, he might be encouraged." Well, those 2 illustrations, one from Ireland and one from Oxford, indicate that you can never tell what God will do if you sow the seed with your friends. You may have the joy of seeing some of them become believers while you're an undergraduate, but in some cases it might happen later, and you might be what we used to call a link in the chain. So never give up. That's why 1 Corinthians 15:58 is so important. Stand firm, continue the work which God has given you to do, for you know that your labor in the Lord is never in vain. He'll bring forth his fruit in his own time. So that made me fall in love with London, with the Republic, and with Islanders in general.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Super. And you mentioned you have been involved with IFES, which some of the folks here won't be familiar with that acronym. It's the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. So that's like the Christian unions worldwide right across the globe. And you mentioned you had different roles there over the years. Why did you stick with IFES? I mean, most people, like I myself, I'm not sure I can call it retiring from IFES. I'll never retire. I'll always support the work in one way or other. But I'm moving on from being a full-time worker with IFES at the end of this conference. But why did you stick with IFES over the years?
Well, 2 reasons. One is I love students, and the second is I love the gospel. I love students because they're so flexible, easy to live with. You make a mistake, they forgive you, and you can make a comeback. One older pastor friend used to say to me about the Christian ministry and pastoring churches, in before 30, out before 40, because you're a bit young and you may make mistakes, and sometimes congregations might be a bit slow to forgive. Students forgive you very quickly and allow you to move on. And I found that as an undergraduate. As a young staff worker, I made many mistakes, but the students were so understanding and so warm and engaging and friendly. and some of them became lifelong friends. I think also related to that is the fact that student ministry is strategic, and I reckon there are two ways you can influence the direction of the church. You can either work with the current leaders, or you can contribute towards shaping and forming the next generation of leaders. And generally, we're more open to being shaped and learning new ideas when we're younger, as students do. I studied history in university, and one of my great heroes was Martin Luther, under God, the architect of the Reformation. He said in 1523, only 6 years after the Reformation started, memorable words, "If you want to change the world, start with a university." And that's because Luther saw how strategic he was. He was converted himself as a young lecturer, 29 years of age. John Calvin in the Institutes says of himself that he was converted as an undergraduate, studying law, first of all, in the University of Orleans. So many leaders in the church and in society who were believers were converted under 25 years of age, often as students. Luther was so committed to universities that there were only 6 universities in Germany when the Reformation started. There were 29 when he died, and he was responsible behind the scenes for forming many of them. Calvin also focused on students himself when he formed his academy in Geneva, from where a lot of missionaries took the gospel into France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Poland, Hungary. I know that because I've been researching this for the last 3 years. I've just written a book on it. The Strategic Vision of Luther and Calvin is coming out next year, and the vision they had for reaching students. So the first reason would be that student work is critical, and I think strategic. And if you have a love for the gospel and want to see it advanced, as I do, one of the best theatres for advancing the cause of the gospel is in the universities of the world. And so God led me into that work many years ago, first of all in my own country. And then I sensed it was too early to finish in student work, so I talked with IFES about helping elsewhere. They wanted to send us to Rwanda at first. That didn't work out, and we ended up in Europe, where we spent 2 years before having the global responsibility.
Super. Many people would say, well, that's all very well for a particular time when the campuses are open, but in a year like this year, where the campuses, many lectures will be online, large groups are banned from meeting, that will mean many of the Christian unions can't meet in person as a whole group. Does that mean that opportunity will be limited, or have you heard any stories from across Europe or across the world of small group evangelism, of CUs that are just meeting in smaller groups, still mightily used by God?
Well, it's not denying it does present a problem for us, and it is difficult. So I sympathize with those who are feeling crushed or not sure what to do. Do you know, one of the most attractive things about students is their creativity. And what's happened was, I'm involved with this team of 60 evangelists. We speak at about 200 university events weeks or mission weeks across Europe each year. We did 130 in January, February, March this year. 70 more were planned for April, May, and June, and they all had to be cancelled. What do you have to do? What can you do in that situation? You can't replace the face-to-face engagement or deny the fact that we're social beings and that we need to be in physical contact with people, seeing people face to face. The screen is insufficient. But having said that, what struck me was the creativity of student groups in many parts of Europe as soon as the shutters came down and we were in lockdown from mid-March onwards. I think 2 or 3 of the best examples I've seen are, firstly, Scotland actually was one of the best. The staff had all been put on furlough, and there was a former staff worker, Kenny Robertson, who had connections with some of the relay workers and the student leaders in the country. And they were trying to mull over how they could reach students in Scotland in the shutdown or the lockdown. And the students had a great idea. Some of them were very dynamic. One or two of them were Irish. I talked to them on a website. Very organized women, and they said, "Why don't we do some kind of online questionnaire with the students we know and we have contact with? And find out what are the top 10 questions or objections people have who are students to believing in the gospel. And then why don't we speak to those top 10 questions?" So they did a survey online and they formulated the top 10 questions, and they were able to invite some very fine speakers from around the world for nothing to give talks on these subjects. My wife was asked to do one on finding wholeness or fulfillment, or finding hope in a time of isolation. It was done online, and she had people listening in and asking questions from China, from Peru, as well as from Scotland and elsewhere. It was amazing. It was such a good model that I shared it when I was supposed to be speaking in Israel in April at their national conference. They were disappointed that they couldn't run it face to face. So we had some online meetings. They were at a loss as to how to connect with their friends. I told them about what the Scots had done with the help of some friends from Northern Ireland. And they said, "Oh, we could do something like that." So they are now organizing an events week to coincide with Freshers Week. And they've chosen the top 5 questions their friends ask. They've invited John Lennox to give one of the talks, a Northern Irish guy in Oxford, professor of mathematics, and 4 others, speakers who normally they couldn't afford to pay to come to Israel. So they're actually building on what the Scots have already done. So I think one of the best illustrations I've seen in recent months was Scotland. The other would have been Serbia, smaller groups. So they decided to do a series of events, one a week, over 6 weeks in the summer term. And they invited, again, 6 very fine speakers from around Europe. They couldn't afford to pay for them to come normally. And they joined with all the other student ministries in the Balkans. So that's Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and all those 5 or 6 countries joined together online, because some of the groups are quite small, 4 or 5 people only. So they were able to have these very fine speakers speaking online at events which were watched by, in some university towns or movements, 5 or 6 people. But because they put the 6 countries together, they were able to put on something better. So I think Scotland and the Balkans are 2 of the best examples I've seen in the last few months. The last one I'd mention is Norway. I heard from a staff worker there in the southern university town of Kristiansand. When they closed down, they thought, how can we reach people? So they decided to have a Guerrilla Christian session. I'm sure you know what they are. You get 2 or 3 Christians who form a panel, and it's like Daniel in the Lion's Den. Non-Christian friends can just throw any questions they like at them. So this staff worker was one of the people with a pastor, and then they invited a sportsman, a well-known sportsman who was a Christian in the country. And a lot of people joined into the online Guerrilla Christian because they were interested to hear what this Christian sportsman had to say, because he was famous. So they asked questions of the 3 of them. And then the question and answer session went on for several hours. 5,000 people listened into that Guerrilla Christian in one university, because it went viral across Norway, across the Nordic countries. I told that to the Israelis, so they're doing a Guerrilla Christian. Now, you don't get those kind of numbers in every country. All I'm saying is that creativity is one of the hallmarks of student groups. Where you have a small group doing things in partnership with colleges or universities in other parts of the island, may be a smart way of working, because you can get good speakers. You can have the sense of camaraderie of working with other groups. And then you can run your own small follow-up meetings locally if you want to, which is what a lot of these groups are doing. You can do that one-to-one or in groups of 4 or 5 or 6, whatever is legally and politically acceptable.
Yeah, super. Well, thanks for sharing some of those ideas. Um, we're also aware that there can be a great danger in these times that we just get shaped by pragmatics of our circumstances, and we say, well, this can't happen because of COVID, and this can happen because of COVID. And things like that, and our Christian Union life just gets shaped by whatever is in front of us. You've seen the rise and fall of many Christian unions and indeed whole movements across countries over the years. What would you advise to young Christian Union leaders to keep front and centre and not to forsake during the next year, despite the pragmatic challenges?
Well, there's a famous saying, which I'm sure you've heard many times in Ireland: keep the main thing, or keep your focus, in other words. And I would say the reason that many CUs around the world have retained their focus is because from the very beginning, the vast majority of student movements all agreed on having the same 3 objectives for all their groups. Interestingly, when I was General Secretary of IFES, I think student ministries joined us in about 50 countries. IFES works in 160 countries around the world now. And I asked to see their constitution before they could be accepted into the movement. And I was always checking, have they got these 3 objectives in their constitution, which were to bear witness to Jesus Christ and non-Christian students and present Jesus to them so that they come to trust him. So evangelism. Secondly, formation or discipleship or biblical rootedness. So teaching and equipping, helping people to put deep roots down in Christ. And thirdly, then world mission, promising to contribute towards the advance of the gospel globally. I found that many of the newer movements forgot that 3rd objective because they thought we're too small to contribute here. And I used to say to them, you may feel that at the beginning of the movement, but eventually you need to see that however small you are, you can make a significant contribution to the advance of the gospel globally. And you need to have that as a stated objective of the CUs. One early leader in IFES, a Norwegian guy called Ola Hallesby, used to say, if we lose our vision for cross-cultural mission, we will die. And that's what happens to student ministries when they only turn in and only have a concern for their city or their republic or Ulster or province or whatever it is, and don't have a wider perspective on the world, because the God of the Bible is a missionary God. So I would say, first of all, make sure in your constitution you have those 3 objectives. All local CUs, I would say, if they have a membership card or a membership statement, should state we have these 3 objectives. And the leaders must always be thinking, how can we fulfill those objectives in the here and now? Whatever our current situation is, what can we do to advance these 3 objectives amongst students in our generation? So I think those 3 are very important. The other is to have a doctrinal basis, a simple statement of the truths that bind you together. You know, there was a student ministry in the 1900s, and it had very similar objectives to CU Ireland, except that they didn't have a doctrinal statement. And they got swayed. They had a very strong missionary vision at first, but then they got swayed by certain political influences that came in. A Black Lives Matter movement, for example, which was very radical, like the contemporary one, but it had other political objectives, Marxist or whatever, particularly Marxism. And so they lost their perspective and they deviated away from focusing on that 3-fold emphasis of evangelism, discipleship, and mission. And they started emphasizing certain things as if they were more important than the gospel-centered truths in the scriptures. There aren't many things that we need to be united on, but the doctrinal basis was formed, which you have, because earlier leaders felt that that prior movement had taken their eye off the ball in terms of the key doctrines. Particularly, they changed their focus on the centrality of Christ, not seeing him as so central, on the nature of salvation, playing down justification, on the centrality of the Bible, saying it was full of errors, and various other things. The cross became not so central. The resurrection, they started to argue, was just wasn't a physical bodily resurrection, but it was a kind of spiritual imaginary thing. They lost their direction, and when you lose the heart of the gospel, you lose what you stand for. So I would say those two things. Ask yourself, go back to basics. What are the core convictions or objectives? Core convictions in terms of doctrines or message, which makes the gospel the gospel. And secondly, what are the objectives which our forefathers and foremothers, those who've gone before us, held to? What did they build this work on? And acknowledge we are building on the foundations which they have laid. Let's continue to focus on those three areas and ask ourselves, in our generation, how then should we live creatively in fleshing out these three objectives? You may have to work a little bit differently in the area of evangelism, as I just mentioned, with some illustrations from Norway, Scotland, and the Balkans, but it's still possible to engage evangelistically. You may be using screens more and not so many public meetings, more small group in the short term. That's okay, but work out how you can fulfill that objective or those objectives in the here and now.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question, I guess there are some graduates with us and folk who have moved on from the Christian unions. Are there still opportunities within the IFES family? You mentioned even looking outwards towards beyond our own settings and things like that. And what do you think are the current opportunities, whether across the globe or more locally, that people can still be involved in?
Well, I think you can be involved at three levels. First of all, undergraduates. Of course, it's going to be difficult to travel in the next year, but my hope is that it may be possible to travel a bit more freely in the summer of next year. And so many student groups across Europe have twinning links with other parts of Europe. In fact, when I was a young staff worker in Wales, we decided that every university would have two twinning links, one with a European country and one with somewhere else in the world. We usually set them up for 3 years at a time, so consecutive generations wouldn't be bound by the vision of the previous generation. If the relationship concluded after 3 years, you could develop a twinning link with another country. When you do that, you can at least exchange news via Skype or Zoom. You can share prayer requests. As you pray for folks at the moment, we're praying for Belarus. I was there last year, and you can see on the television every night the big demonstrations there. The police broke into an events week there 18 months ago and took some of the staff off and imprisoned them overnight, and really threatened to shut down the student ministry. That's just one example. If you have a link with another student group in another part of Europe and or other parts of the world, when you see the situation in other countries, it does one of two things. You either say, thank God things are not as bad here as they are there. We've got much more than they have in their situation. So it can be a rebuke and a challenge to see how difficult, much more difficult it is in other countries than in our own. It's very easy to be negative about our own situation and cynical if we're only looking at our own situation. If you look on the needs and the situations of others, it gives you perspective. Both that other situations are better or freer, but also it provokes you to ask, when you see other situations growing, what are they doing that we can learn from? Maybe they could be a good example to us. Well, there are student ministries in 160 countries around the world, so take your pick. You know, approach other countries, approach a country where it's tough, maybe a North African country like Tunisia, small work there, or Israel, or the Egyptian movement, or Lebanon, where there's a student work, and of course, It's a terrible situation there at the moment since the bomb went off, that explosion a couple of weeks ago. That's the kind of situation where you gain perspective by saying, thank God we're in a relatively stable context. But there may be others where you might link up with hugely dynamic group in Ethiopia, the biggest in the world, with 45,000 students meeting in small groups every week. In the UK, it's 15,000. So Ethiopia is 3 times as large. I remember visiting there 25 years ago when it was 5,000. So they've grown by 9 times in 25 years.
Wow.
When you see that, you ask, you're rebuked, and you ask, what can we learn from them? So if you're an undergraduate, develop twinning links, have prayer nights, praying around the world, use Operation World, and so on. There are many things you can do to engage with student groups, along with summer teams and summer programs, going to other movements as a team. I used to take 3 teams every summer when I was a young student worker to other parts of Europe to work on summer teams, Italy, Israel, Romania, and so on. Secondly, if you're a young postgraduate, there are opportunities to serve as relay workers or co-workers, particularly in a European context, places like Paris or Nice or Italy. In fact, Alison Jane, who is one of your staff workers, went with her husband Hugh when he was going to pastor a church in Torino. And she worked at first alongside the student ministry in Italy, and then started getting invitations to offer some teaching or training in some other parts of Europe. But I've known others from Ireland who have gone on these year teams. My son was on a year team in Nice. The first one, there were 5 people, 6, 3 women, 3 men. One of the women was from Northern Ireland. Very dynamic Ulster woman, very feisty. Went to work subsequently for a senator in the US. So from Belfast to Nice to Washington. Look out where these Irish women end up. So there are opportunities to serve on these year-long teams. I was just talking on a Zoom call yesterday with 2 people from UCCF, the British movement, who are both going to Italy for the year as young graduates. The third possibility is if you're a university teacher or lecturer, you can help out as a resource person. Like the Tyrrells I mentioned earlier, when they were in Cork, they used their home for hospitality. So they supported these young folks who were trying to pioneer the work. We went for tea there. I know one university teacher in Vienna who has the CU committee in the University of Vienna for breakfast once a month. So he asks them how they're doing, and they ask advice of him, and they pray together, and they have a nice breakfast, probably the best meal of the week for those students. But he's helping behind the scenes in that context. Then there are others who are university lecturers who have expertise in communicating the gospel from their perspective. You've had many of these particularly from Northern Ireland. John Lennox does it as a mathematics professor. David Glass is very popular speaker. Of course, he's a lecturer in is it technology or computer science and studies. But David is much loved in Belarus, the country I just mentioned, where he's going to give a series of lectures on science and faith. So you can work in all of these 3 ways, whether you're an undergraduate, a young graduate, or a university lecturer whose main job is in his home country, but might be free for several weeks a year to help out.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for sharing about those opportunities. We're going to have to draw things to a close for this time. Any final words you would want to say to all of the students, staff and supporters of Christian Unions Ireland?
I'd have to repeat what I said earlier, which is keep the main thing the main thing. Focus on the gospel, the advance of the gospel, finding creative ways to engage with non-Christian friends. Always focus on helping believing students to put deep roots down in Christ. People grow so rapidly over 3 years. By deep roots, I mean understanding the great doctrinal truths in Scripture, which are given to root us in Christ. Don't despise doctrine. You know, I grew up in a church where one of the leaders said to me, oh, doctrine, it only divides people. It can do, but good doctrine, if you read the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 32 or 28, the first 2 or 3 verses, God speaking through Moses says, my doctrine will come to you like the dew in the morning. Now, the purpose of the dew is to refresh the grass, not to burn it. In other words, the great doctrines are given to strengthen us, to root us, not to bore us. And so these great truths like the grace of God, the sovereignty of God, the goodness of God, the fatherhood of God, adoption into God's family, the uniqueness of Christ, the death and bodily resurrection of Jesus. These are the things that hold us together. While you're undergrad, just make sure you clearly understand those truths and embrace them. Don't just seek to understand them, but embrace them before you leave university. And then thirdly, maintain that focus on world mission. Those 3 things, keep to those main things as a student ministry. Then be creative. Always be thinking, taking time to try to understand your cultural context and how you can fulfill those 3 objectives given the current situation creatively. Students have always been wonderful in terms of their expression of creativity. Then think and aim big. I remember doing an events week once with a Welsh evangelist. His name was David Shepherd. We met in a McDonald's bar in Cardiff railway station. And I'd invited this group of students, there were 18 of them, to do an events week or a mission week. They'd never done one in the history of their university. And they were totally petrified. So I thought they can't do much. They're so frightened of reaching out to their friends in case they're rejected. So I met up with this guy who was a larger than life figure. And he had a big jaw. He was an ex-boxer. He stuck his jaw over the table in McDonald's. He said, Lindsay, what are you planning for this events week? They used to call them mission weeks then. I said, oh, nothing very much, David. It's a small group. They're petrified. Have to go softly, softly. He stuck his jaw out and he said, look, brother, I decided early on in the Christian life, I was never going to aim small in God's work. If you're not going to aim big, invite somebody else. So I went back and told the students, it galvanized them. The first prayer meeting in the morning, all 18 turned up. They were petrified. I could hear their knees knocking. But there was one wonderful story of the leader of the student ministry, of the student union, who was a wild woman. Became a Christian in the middle of the night after hearing him give a talk on what God thinks of the Welsh. She was intrigued by the title. And of course, he started off by saying God thinks of the Welsh exactly like he does of everybody else. He created us. He loves us. He's concerned for our sin. And so he sent Jesus to die for us. And he shared the gospel. Anyway, 2 o'clock in the morning, this girl who was the leader of the student union hammered on the door of a Christian and said, let me in. I must become a Christian tonight. I can't wait till breakfast time. Well, that was a small group. So the last thing I would say is, don't be judged by your numerical strength. Some of the best, most dynamic student groups I've ever seen have been 5 people. Some of the weakest have been 300. Because sometimes when the numbers are very large, people can become soft and they can become pew warmers. You can see that in some large churches. I've done mission weeks or events weeks in some CUs that were very large and they were weak. Whereas I've done some mission weeks with a group of 5-10 students, it was all hands on deck. They were all involved because everybody counted. So don't judge yourself. For example, if you're in a small group in the Republic, don't judge yourself as being weak by comparison with a large group in Ulster. They're not necessarily spiritually stronger than you if they're not reaching out effectively, if they're not rooted doctrinally, if they don't have much missionary vision. God doesn't look upon the numbers, and sometimes he cuts the numbers. Remember the story of Gideon? where Gideon got this army together and God told him it's too big for an army, cut it down. And, you know, that's what I sometimes do in student work. I send some people away and say, we're going to have a smaller group because we're going to focus on these things. Sometimes when you do that, some people will leave, and that's okay. If they're not prepared to focus on the vision and the convictions which drive the group. So you might have an impact out of all proportion to your size. Think big, trust a great God, be experimental, be creative, be bold, encourage one another, be positive, and go for it. And don't hold back.
Marvellous. Thank you ever so much, Lindsay, for your time and your wisdom and all that you've shared with us today. Thank you.